Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm having a cup of tea with my great good friend Hoyt Richards today.
Absolutely.
There we are.
John, lovely to see you as always.
Likewise.
Spring is sprung, so
At last.
life is kind of semi-returning to normal. But
the Santana winds have blown out the smog, and it's on its way back into LA, I should think, by now.
Yeah. I mean, it's I'm hoping it's going to be a pretty normal summer compared to last summer, but we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be interesting. But I wanted to talk to you about, we were talking about this earlier, this whole pandemic and how we've all been dealing with it. I think in many ways, people are kind of experiencing a cultic relationship with the COVID pandemic. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that as far as, I think it's challenging for people to find news or medical information they can trust. There's clearly a huge amount of fear mongering. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of contradictions. It's a challenging time to try to get your bearings on what's going on, how to make a good choice for yourself. How do you feel like you're getting information you feel is legitimate or science-based? I think it's a really tricky time, but I would have never thought that that being in a cult and going through that experience could prepare me in some way for what we're going through now. So there's all sorts of silver linings that come out from these experiences that you never know. So I think that's been interesting for me, because if I had to put it in one anecdote, the first time I walked out the street and I saw another person walking towards me on the sidewalk, and the moment they recognized like I was a human, they froze terrified and ran to the other side of the street. And I said, this is dangerous. This is dangerous. No one normally gets to that mental state on their own. There's an indoctrination process to get you there. And I said, this can't be good. So
pandemics, there have been a few in human history. In 1347, and I'm sure somebody will write in the comments they've got the date wrong, the Black Death, as it is known, hit Europe. It is said to have killed about a third of the people, 33 1/3% of the people, maybe more in Europe. And one of the effects of this was that many people came to believe that this was a punishment from God. And so they therefore decided that the best thing to do was to torture themselves until God forgave them. And so throughout Europe, there were flagellants. These people, you see them in Bergman's Seventh Seal.
Like self-flagellation,
but they're using leather straps which have iron nails in them. And they're walking around beating themselves with these things, because their belief was that God was angry for something or other, and that to make God take this terrible plague away, the best thing to do would be to whip themselves bloody. I don't usually get nationalistic, but I'm happy to report that when they tried to enter England, they were forbidden, and there were no flagellant processions in England. So I'm led to believe. But these extreme reactions, if we go into the late 1920s, early 1930s in Germany, where there's suddenly this incredible instability, then we start seeing panic reactions and we start seeing confusion. And exactly that will happen whenever there is some severe challenge to us. So a friend of mine who doesn't like to be called a conspiracy theorist, I'm not really sure. He says, well, the rest of you are all coincidence theorists. Okay. But he told me very near the beginning, around about March last year, that either this was a completely invented ruse on behalf of the secret world government, which is run by Queen Elizabeth II, in case you weren't aware of that.
Or the 12 families, aren't there 12 families or something like that, that rule the world, something like that?
She's the most important one. She's a trans-dimensional lizard. and she's also the head of the Zionist organized government and the Illuminati.
Mm-hmm.
It's well known.
Yeah.
You just obviously don't have the right information sources. What can I say?
Really?
So
Yeah.
either it was completely faked, or it was a plan on Bill Gates' part to implant us all. Initially, it was with a microchip, and later it was on with a laser marker, which all of the vaccine things would carry. How you would get, the Chinese with Sinopharm, the Russians with Sputnik, Oxford AstraZeneca, all of these pharmaceutical companies to agree to do this, I don't know. But it is fascinating. And I find myself starting to chase down threads. And so the first thread was Bill Gates, and he recommended a program by James Corbett, who I didn't know about, but has put out a lot of things challenging what is commonly believed, let's put it that way. And there was this program about Bill Gates and what a rotten person Bill Gates is. And, there was a little clip of Bill Gates boasting about how much money he'd made from vaccines.
Right.
It's hard to argue with that, But on pulling this thread a little further, I found out that the first person to spread the rumor about Bill Gates cutting the population of the world down was the head of the Nation of Islam, not Louis Farrakhan, but the one before him, Isaiah Muhammad, was it? Elijah Muhammad. In 1996, he said that the reason that Gates was putting vaccines into Africa was to kill off as many of the people there as he possibly could. And so here we are 25 years later, and the plot has failed. The African population has continued to go up. So we love stories, and the way that stories, my friend Yuval Noah says, talking about certain traditional ideas in evolution, like the idea that we have these modules in our brains that developed on the savannah, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just the way it is. That this is a lovely story, but it doesn't actually have any evidence to support it. And I think there lies the rub, that we love stories. We love to fit things together that seem to make sense.
I mean, certainly in my cult, the conspiracy theories played a huge part. It continues to feed the fear.
Mine too.
It continues to, feed the us versus them mentality. David versus Goliath kind of mentality, that you're very much up against it, and are you going to be the warrior that takes on the big bad wolf? But as a filmmaker and a storyteller, I also find conspiracy theories fascinating because they're potentially great stories to tell, not from the point of view of, oh, this is definitively true, but, oh, this really does play on your fears and would be very engaging to say, what if? What if it was like this? So I think one of the ones I found, I've been hearing about is that everyone taking the vaccine might be, that might be spreading the virus. That's the routine, it's like all of that. So, but I mean, that and alone as a story is a really powerful, you play on people's fear of they're trying to do what they think is right, and actually it's sabotaging themselves and potentially others. I mean, that's a really powerful story. So yeah, I think it's trying to navigate through those waters of very often the so-called truth is boring and the stories are a lot more interesting, so we're drawn to them. But I think the challenge, as I was saying in the beginning, is what sources can you trust, and where can you get the information? You've got, my God, there's so many doctors saying one thing and other doctors saying other things, and there's no continuity even within the medical community. And I have to be perfectly honest. I think when you get into big pharma and those big corporations, I get more suspicious than thinking what the local doctor who's actually dealing with the patients would tell me, what's been their direct experience. I'd rather hear that than what big pharma declares is the way to do it. So yeah, I think it's a really challenging time from that point of view. And as you're saying, people fall into extremist points of view. Either it's a hoax or it's the end of the world. And obviously both of those are extreme and both of them are unrealistic. So trying to find your way somewhere into the middle I think is the goal, but it's not easy to do, especially where it doesn't seem, and again, I'm not a big fan of the news, but it doesn't seem there's many news sources that are trying to put something in the middle. They're either going one of the two ways. And so I think it's probably a really, really hard time for people to get their bearings. And, I think they're incredibly vulnerable because of that. It's there's that desire to find the truth, which can put you in a position to really be manipulated. Because, I think, you have to have that balance between, do I have to know the truth about how it all makes sense, or am I okay with just knowing enough to help me get through the day and deal with the things that I know I can directly impact as far as my family, friends, career, that type of thing? Or do I have to figure it all out? And I think that's where people really kind of struggle, and that desire to figure it all out, to know the truth, to be right, to point others out as being wrong, really takes you down some dark rabbit holes.
Yeah, I mean, the black and white thinking, the polarized way of thinking about things,
right,
and the passion that becomes invested in that, where emotion becomes a barrier to information. The process which is being called gatekeeping,
right,
which Steve Hassan calls information control.
right,
So that information is rejected because of its sources. I mean, from the very beginning, I subscribed to the magazine New Scientist, and I have done for 30-something years. And it's written by science journalists. So the first part is, it's not the normal media.
right,
Not just journalists who are asking people questions. They're people with science degrees who have some idea of what they're talking about.
right.
Sadly, it's just been taken over by the Daily Mail, which is not regarded as necessarily the most trustworthy of sources. But whatever. It means that every week I'm seeing this, probably 4 or 5 pieces written about COVID-19 and what's happening with it. And the omitted information, which has not been there, so, I've read what 250 pieces in the last year about this, written by people who understand science. The omitted information repeatedly is the efficacy of testing, that we're being told by virologists who are specialized in this field that the tests actually have a very high false positive negative possibility. They're around about 80% accurate. So, that it's interested me that's not much has been made of that. However, in saying that, some of the people writing for New Scientists are virologists and some are epidemiologists. So you're actually dealing not with medical doctors who have a degree of understanding. You're dealing with people who've specialized in this field. And from the very start, there was certain pieces of advice. One of the guys who was one of the people who first found coronaviruses in the 60s wrote and said, it's a very good idea to take zinc oxide.
Right.
And this is a general idea. We've come up with the idea, it's been repeatedly said that if you have insufficient vitamin D, and in Los Angeles you shouldn't have, but where I live is...
no, I've heard that predominantly, the vitamin D aspect of it. Almost everyone who's had a really bad case of COVID or died had that low vitamin D. That was one of the things I had heard.
And that leads to the mistaken notion that if you take a huge quantity of vitamin D, you'll be protected. That is a nonsense.
Right.
It's having inadequate vitamin D for your system, which is 400 to 800 international units a day, the recommended daily allowance. So there are things that we can do that seem to be generally recommended by medical experts, and that's the first part of authority. That if I want to know about how to fix the wiring in my house, do I go to Boris Johnson or Joe Biden?
Right.
Or do I go to an electrician?
Right. Exactly.
And I mean, with as we experience, one of the things that makes something a cult, an authoritarian group, a destructive cult, is the idea that the leader knows everything. And I too suffered in a group where there was the World Bank conspiracy, which edged onto. It was funny because I read I read a wonderful book about Charlie Coughlin and Huey Long.
Okay.
What was it called? Visions of something or other. But it was about that period in the US where Huey Long was called the dictator of Louisiana. He was the governor there. And Charlie Coughlin ran the most popular radio show that has ever been broadcast. More people listened to Coughlin than have ever listened to anybody else. Wow. It was said you could walk from one end of New York to the other when his sermons were being given on a Sunday. And because the windows were open, you wouldn't miss a word.
Wow. So what year was this when he was?
We're dealing in the 1930s here.
Okay. All right.
And Coughlin was a Catholic priest. He headed the Church of the Little Flowers. And what a lovely name that is.
It is.
And eventually, the Pope told him he'd got to shut up because he kept saying what a great bloke Hitler was. But yeah, we come to this place where, what is the source of authority? Is it somebody with a very loud voice? Is it somebody who's got a great story that's really attractive? Or is it somebody who's gone off and studied this thing for years and has something to say? And there will be some dissent, even among virologists. But it's like with climate change that I think we've got 97% of climatologists agree that global warming is taking place. 3% don't. That's why science is great, because there's always somebody challenging it. There's always somebody saying you could be wrong about this. But as somebody, that's a subject that's fascinated me since school. I was 16 when in 1971, when I first read about the greenhouse effect. The idea was put forward in the 50s. And it kind of made sense, but we all knew that the world was going to freeze. That's what was going to happen. There was going to be another ice age. It was well known. So I kind of put that over to the side. And gradually, as the years advanced, more evidence accumulated. And we had the depletion of the ozone layer that became quite interesting in the early 1980s, and the banning chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, from aerosols, largely because of Margaret Thatcher. Because Margaret Thatcher, who's not somebody I particularly admire, but she was the only British Prime Minister ever to have a science degree. She had a degree in chemistry, and she understood that chlorofluorocarbons break down oxygen-3, ozone, heavy oxygen. So she pushed for something to happen in the world, and it did. Those substances were banned. The ozone layers, we're told, are recovering, which is something's good to hear in all of the chaos and calamity. But for me, it was only in the 1980s where they started digging ice cores, which Al Gore completely misinterprets in An Inconvenient Truth, but let's not get into Al Gore. But the ice cores showed that there were periods where there were different levels of carbon dioxide and various other, some of the nitrogen gases, and of course methane, which we're this week hearing about a great deal. And gradually evidence accumulated to show that
is the methane coming from all the cows' behinds? Is that the
quite a lot of it? But our landfill, that we bury a lot of food waste, and rather than composting it to make good soil, bury it, and it will produce methane as it's rotting. It's also a side product of the oil industry, I think, along the way.
Interesting.
And it's a far more rapidly acting gas. They have already genetically modified cows, so they'll produce a minimal amount of it. But obviously that comes up against the Greenpeace campaign against Frankenfoods.
Oh my goodness. Well, have you on a similar topic, have you seen Seaspiracy yet? The documentary on Netflix about the overfishing?
No, but I've signed a petition on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I recommend it. It's I'm trying to think. I can't think whether it's an American guy or Brit. I can't remember now. But yeah, he starts off just having an issue with the way dolphins are killed when they're doing all this fishing. They're caught in the nets and that sort of thing. Then he starts finding out that there's so many different kinds of fish and sharks and whales that get caught in the nets that they just, execute when they catch them. And it just starts taking him down a rabbit hole where ultimately what he ends up discovering is that in the so-called sustainability world, which is kind of, the area you're talking about now, the greatest impact on it is the abuse of the oceans, and the greatest problem in that area is the overfishing.
Yeah.
And throwing off the whole, ecological cycle, and on top of it, the complaints of, the waste and plastic that's in the waters. It's not from human waste. I mean, human waste is a part, but it's a small fraction. It's all these nets they just dump all over the place. And so the worst part of it, these sustainability organizations that are supposed to be looking out for the planet have been more or less paid off by the fishing lobbies to never mention that this is the greatest problem on the planet, and no one knows about it because they're all paid off. So
my friend, who doesn't like being called a conspiracy theorist, says this is because Prince Philip, who sadly has now passed away,
right,
tender age of 99, that he was running the World Wildlife Fund, which is the heart of the conspiracy. And so I think you're supporting this idea. That there's a fantastically FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I'm told it was actually his doctor who said it to him, but it is a fascinating point that we do when we become alarmed enough, we become controllable. We are unable to find the answers for ourselves, so we latch onto some authority.
That's exactly it, John. That's where the rubber meets the road. Yeah, because how prevalent when fear is in the picture, it's very hard to critically think, and that desire to find the answer or be told you're going to be safe becomes so intense that you'll accept anything that seems to be in many ways the loudest voice at the time, and that's where the control and the fanaticism and the extremism just play a huge part, because they're usually the ones with the loudest voices, and then ultimately peer pressure starts playing a role. It's like it's incredible how the shaming aspect of people who not consider that now they know what the truth is, and they look at someone else and they're just shaming them immediately when do you really understand what the situation is? And so I think all of that is man, we are living right in the thick of it. So
we're living in a blizzard of information. There's never been a time like this before, and every year it goes more. So I was very pleased. My favorite documentary in this last year, and I did like My Octopus Teacher. I thought that was great.
Yeah, that was great.
Letting them bite off the poor thing, but whatever. There's been an amazingly positive documentary about the environment called The Serengeti Rules.
Oh, and I'm not familiar with that one. Huh?
This is super science-based. The guy who wrote the book and then goes off to make the documentary is interviewing the actual scientists, 5 of them, I think, who did the research, and you're shown each piece of research. And it starts with a guy who's looking at, well, how do you look at changes in an environment? And he looks at, this was in the 60s, I think. He's looking at tide pools. And so he starts hoiking the starfish out of some of the tide pools so that there are no starfish in them. And they degenerate. So this predator, when it's taken out, allows other things to grow, which then destroy the habitat. Yeah, right. That led to the idea of the Keystone Species. And looking over at
the Keystone Species, meaning like the critical species for the whole. Okay.
So somebody else was looking at the Aleutian Islands off Canada and the northwest of Vancouver, and watching the collapse of the sea otter populations. And they tracked that back and realized what was happening was that killer whales had eaten all the seals they could get, and now they were eating the sea otters. And the reason they were doing that was because of whaling in the 1960s. So the human intervention had taken away the whales that the killer whales would normally prey upon, and now they were taking out these species. The Serengeti itself, the Keystone Species, is the wildebeest. And there was a a guy there, and who had control of the area, and a lot of environmental scientists were saying you've got to start culling the wildebeest because the numbers are growing enormously. They'd suffered a disease at the beginning of the last century which had really cut their numbers, and now they were recovering from it. And they got to a certain point, and he said, they were doubling the population every year. Really huge accumulation of wildebeest. What are you going to do with that? And so he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And they stabilized. They got to a point where you've got this many wildebeest, and then everything else came back, the grasslands. So now they found that there are keystone species in rice paddies in China. It's a wolf spider. If you take that out, then the paddies fail.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because I do remember seeing, I don't know if it was a documentary or an article, I think it was an article about some of the national parks out west here in America where they had eliminated the wolf. And the wolf, I think, feeds on deer and that sort of thing. And when the deer ran, they literally ate all the crops and everything became dry. They couldn't grow anything. I mean, the whole ecosystem kind of got crashed. So it's very much in that line of thinking you're describing that. And when you go, you'll see when you're in this, and again, I don't know how accurate everything this guy is. It's just one guy doing his research, creating a documentary, but it's pretty alarming to, because they have a lot of specialists that he's interviewing of how the system's being altered because of, man's intervention. And the other side of it, they said, though, if you stop it, like you're describing, the planet recovers quite quickly. Like the extraordinary ability for it to heal is there, but you can't push it too far. Like we're at kind of they're always creating the drama. Like we're at the crossroads, but I don't know enough to make any yay or nay stance on that. But it's certainly alarming to see, and certainly the fact that it's largely illegal what they're doing, and the fact that it's just, I mean. I love fish, and I started thinking after watching the show, like, oh my God, should I curb back my fish? I mean, you start thinking along those lines. So this type of storytelling is very, very impactful.
And you come to the point where, this is something I've been pondering for nearly 40 years now. I stopped buying anything that came from South Africa during apartheid. And so for 15, 20 years, I didn't buy anything that came from South Africa.
No rooibos?
No rooibos. Very sad. Thankfully, I didn't drink it then, so
okay.
I didn't realize,
Lovely
awful now.
Yeah.
But then that was challenged when Paul Simon released Graceland, and the Musicians Union started saying, right, we're going to boycott Paul Simon because he's broken our ban. And there was Sun City, where a lot of bands like Status Quo, I remember, went and played there, and they'd be boycotted thereafter, which is understandable because they were playing to a white audience in a place where nobody black could afford a ticket. What Paul Simon did was he went there and recorded local musicians, and then went back to New York and cut and pasted everything back together in the most remarkable way. There's a wonderful documentary called Classic Albums about the mixing of. Do you realize that the Everly Brothers sang on Graceland?
No, I didn't realize.
No, they're so far back in the mix you can't hear them. But you got Don and Phil there, his heroes of childhood. Just a remarkable genius, a remarkable man. But it begged this question, because he was saying, I've now made these South African musicians famous, and they're earning money. And they, under the ban, they could never have been heard by the world. So, Ladysmith Black Mambaza, for example, wouldn't have had hits, or danced around in their gumboots, which is great. And the same kind of knock-on effects that what I object to is generally the governments of countries, not the people. So I've been to Russia, and I really liked it, and I really liked the Russian people I met. I've been to America, and there are people who, after George W. Bush, it was said that he had, for the first time, united the world in one thing, which was the hatred of America. You know, he's not very popular. But,
right.
you know, I like Americans too. Let me say that. Let me be quite public about that. I've met people from all over the world and I like them. But governments, and here is a problem, here is a rub, that we seem to have created a political system which has come from tyranny. You know, the traditional human system is psychopathic tyranny.
Yeah.
Kings and queens, emperors,
Right.
all of that
Right.
kind of stuff. And even the great liberators like Napoleon pretty quickly put on a crown, you know, and elect their own brothers and sisters, kings and queens. We've moved from that into kind of elective tyranny. So we now elect our tyrants, and every few years we replace them with another tyrant. Without,
I completely concur, man. That's why I have very little interest in politics, because I recognize immediately from my background the tyrannical vibe that you're describing, the corruption, the deception, you know, the just dishonesty. I mean, all tactics that I'm very familiar with from my cult days. And, you know, I mean, it's almost a feeling, you know, I'd be curious to get your thoughts, but it's almost like I feel at this point, if you had even something remotely resembling a moral compass, you would not be allowed in. Like they would, it's like a club that unless you're compromised, they will not let you in. And so, yeah, it's tragic. I mean, I don't know what to say other than it's just put me in a position of just disinterested in following, you know, politics, because I just can't really trust what I'm being told, you know, because it's not being presented in a way to get me to think. It's like it's an indoctrination process, you know, whether it's the, you know, the party system, whatever. It's, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think it's incredibly terrible.
We generally have the choice of the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, and I think that's what most people describe all the time, right? Yeah. Yeah. When's the last time you really felt someone in an elected office, you know, that you really admired? And then I would also possibly, you know, maybe this is my conspiratorial background of, you know, the cultists. I would probably wager that the people that carry the most influence when it comes to government, or, you know, the way things actually end up happening, are the people that are more behind the scenes, that aren't elected, that kind of pull the strings and allow the people who are more egocentric and want the limelight, let them kind of play the elected game, so to speak. But they're not necessarily inclined to be to a particular party. They just have a particular agenda that they can fulfill no matter which party's in power. And I feel like that's probably the way it really works. Like, you have the dog and pony show, you know, happening, you know, with the so-called elected people, but the people probably really deciding, you know, what happens and how things go down are in the background to some degree, and you know, wouldn't allow themselves to be in the precarious position of having to be elected, you know, because that's just too, you know, risky. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, that's why I can't get. And when I meet people who are intensely political, it just feels cultic to me. It just feels the same kind of another form of extremism, and it just, you know, I just, it gets me a sour taste in my mouth. You know?
It is about the moral compass, and it is about an attitude. As you say, you know, people like Hoover or Bill Donovan or the Dulles brothers or Henry Kissinger in American politics had far more effect than the elected politicians.
Yeah, right.
And were all of them corrupt. Every one of them thoroughly, absolutely corrupt. And that they, you know, would then allow somebody like Nixon to you know, govern a country, a man who wanted to use short-range nuclear missiles against the campuses of American universities. For real.
I never heard that. Boy, really?
Yeah, he had discussions about that. I mean, and he was a fan of Norman Vincent Peale, who of course was the Trump's family's guru, the power of positive thinking. And on the drunken night when he decided to bomb Cambodia, which is a war crime, you know, bombing a country. I mean, the US was never at war with Vietnam. It was said to be a police action, but to actually just go and bomb Cambodia.
Yeah.
He was drunk and he called up Norman Vincent Peale and said, "What do you think I ought to do?" speaking of cult leaders and authorities.
Mhm.
There is, however, I mean, we have it at the moment, we have a political advisor called Dominic Cummings, who pretty much was the leader of the group that tricked us out of the European Union with Brexit. And he had before that been the advisor to our education minister, Michael Gove, who said,
Right.
we've all had enough of experts, and he was his expert. And he then was a senior advisor to Boris Johnson. And a few months ago, that all came apart.
Mhm.
And he's now in attack mode. And I think Johnson will definitely suffer for it, because Cummings is a brilliant PR guy. He knows how to get at things. But there is a possibility of change. There's talk of the difference between dominance leadership and prestige leadership. So Jacinda Ardern,
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah.
she is called a prestige leader because she goes to the people and embraces the people and talks with the people and listens to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, has guided New Zealand through COVID-19. I think they've had about 9 deaths.
Yeah, they've been. I've heard that she's doing an incredible job. Yeah, and she's fairly young, isn't she?
She is fairly young,
Yeah.
and
It's very impressive.
the interesting thing is to see some of the, you know, the conventional plutocracy supported by the corrupt, you know, plutocrats, the people like Bolsonaro, who's now hopefully going to be removed, having been shown that the removal of the former president was completely fraudulent. Duterte in the Philippines, the man who has boasted that his only crime is the extrajudicial killings. So all he's done is murder some people. I mean, what's wrong with that? I think that it's a change in our view about authoritarianism. This idea that we have to have people to bully us, to tell us what to do, who know what they're doing.
Right.
And submitting to that. And authoritarianism is both ends of that scale. We have to actually move to get a democracy. And a democracy would be something where people were informed enough and capable enough to make decisions. It can sort of work. Switzerland has a referendum democracy. No significant change of law can occur without a referendum.
Right.
But they're also major arms brokers, which is how their economy works. So I'm a little hesitant about adopting that model universally. But to get rid of the corruption in politics, to emphasize, whistleblowers, people who should be rewarded, Jeffrey Wigand, the insider in the tobacco industry. This man should have been given a massive pension for life. And instead his life was destroyed by the 7 dwarfs of the tobacco industry. To actually respect morality. There's a story that comes from the Plains people in America, which is something that really I got very interested. I actually wrote a play about the Ponca people who used to live with the Cheyenne on one side of them and the Lakota on the other, and had to fight them off every year. And there was a journalist who lived there who wrote a book about the time before the gold rush, the purchase of California in 1847, the gold rush of 49. Before that had started to devastate the Plains people. And he went out hunting with them. He was great friends with, the Omaha or one of the tribes there. And he pointed to this thing, which was, of course, now they'd got horses and guns. It was much easier to kill a lot of buffalo, and they were doing. There's one tribe who were known for driving them over a cliff and then just taking the tongues because that's the tastiest bit. So all of this kind of sentimental idea of, looking after the land, they were corrupted by what happened to them. But what really appealed to me was that whoever killed the most buffalo had to give them all away. Their idea of nobility was generosity, not meanness, which is our idea of nobility, how rich you are, as opposed to how generous you are. And it's a cultural difference that could be of great value. It left them in trouble because when they were put on reservations, they gave everything away.
Right.
And then they were given smallpox blankets by the government in the
Oh, I
greatest
know.
poisoning in all
Yeah.
history. But
Oh, that is just so awful. Yeah, I know that whole part of our history. But I think where the rubber meets the road, and what you were saying earlier about trying to find a healthier democracy is having the populace become more informed. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier. How does an average Joe find their way to finding information that they feel they can trust? And this, with this, as you said, this blizzard of information that's out there now, and unfortunately, if I have to state an opinion, I don't think people get motivated to even do any sort of research unless they've been somehow emotionally charged, and leaning even towards a way where it's almost extremist, like that's what gets the fire going, and so I don't have any answers to this one. I mean, it's just, I try as best I can to just observe and learn and keep taking things in, and just do my best to kind of be open-minded and try to hear as many sides as I'm available without making myself nuts, and just always figure like it's never going to be as bad as someone says, and it's never going to be as good as another person said. It's always going to be somewhere in that shades of gray, because it's that black and white thinking that I'm just, I hope I had my quota for so far through my cult experience. I just don't want to fall into that kind of way of thinking again.
it should make us more skeptical, but it should not make us cynical. We shouldn't
right.
have rose-tinted or grey-tinted glasses on, and we should question things. And there's a problem with the notion of authority for human beings, because there are two very distinct forms of authority. One of them is expertise. If I want my wiring checking, I don't go to Boris Johnson, I ask the electrician. If there's something wrong with me physically, I see a doctor. I see somebody who knows something about it, who's studied about it, and I can treat that with a certain caution. I can find out something about a specialist I'm going to see, because here you can go online and look at what their reputation is to some extent. So the one kind of authority is expert authority, and we need that, and to reject that leaves us nowhere, basically. Then to be able to differentiate between the different authorities, it is largely a matter of, I don't know about this, what are the majority of the experts saying?
Right, yeah.
The other side, however, is rank authority, that somebody has authority because they're holding a gun.
Right, yeah.
They have they're the headmaster, head teacher of a school, they're a politician, and they make pronouncements like, we've all had enough of experts, to quote Michael Gove. And I've had enough of Michael Gove, I must say. Absolutely. I had it up to here with him. That finding out certain simple things. So, I mean, the last 7 or 8 years, my focus has been absolutely on teaching teenagers about how to recognize predatory people, because our problem is that our society is governed by predators. It's governed by, there are people who've acquired wealth by giving benefit to humanity, but inherited wealth, as it's passed through our society, I fear, largely comes from the slave trade. It is still the residue, in this country, 90% of the families that are wealthy now were wealthy in 1900, and their money.
Oh, wow. I've never thought about that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that we have a perversity, because in 1834, it was decided that slavery would be made completely illegal. Up until then, it had been banned to buy and sell people, but you could keep breeding your slaves, right?
Wow.
And eventually the abolitionists sort of pointed out this was crazy. So in 1838, the British government made the largest compensation payment it has ever made to the people who'd had to give up their slaves. And the slaves got nothing.
Wow.
And those people, there's a register of every one of the people and how much they received. So, for example, there's a woman who was the widow of a vicar in Yorkshire, and she owned half a slave in the West Indies, and she had to be compensated for that. The slave was just put out to
Right.
fend for himself. But through the distribution of sugar, which was the cash crop, and through slavery that perpetuated that, through cotton that perpetuated that, fortunes were made. And then you have people who are basically confidence tricksters. There are people who give something of value to society and take something back and become rich.
Right.
But very many of the people who amass fortunes are people who've tricked us into buying something like Windows 95 or Windows 98 or Windows 2000. I'm not mentioning any names here, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And to give power to those people, to the descendants of people, and let's face it, when you look at kings and queens, you pretty quickly see that their descendants in the next direction are in fact transdimensional lizards, that they're incompetent. So when Oliver Cromwell died, a nasty mean man, his son Richard was incapable of ruling. And so they went, oh, let's have the king back. Let's have Charles II, who'd actually made a deal to sell the English crown to the French and to convert everybody to Catholicism. So he was an enemy of the people. Wow. And then had 17 mistresses and, was just an awful, diabolical human being. But nonetheless, created the Royal Society for Science and this sort of thing. But that competence is not inherited, that the idea of genetics, blue blood, just doesn't work. So the Ford family or the Gettys or the Guggenheims, the idea that they continue to have such power in society, they can threaten politicians. If you like when the US Congress some years ago wanted to declare that there'd been a genocide against the Armenian people by the Turks in 1915, and they were told by the Turks that the US could remove its missiles from Turkish soil if that decision was made. What do we do? This is realpolitik. Well, when the people telling you what to do are this little group of self-interested people, when it costs $1 billion to become president in the US.
Oh, I know.
What happened to democracy and what happened to choice?
Well, exactly. And then the old adage, history is written by the winners. So even the perspective of what even happened is skewed based on the people who are in power.
I think that has changed. I think since the 1940s that there's a kind of science of history that has taken place.
Well, that's comforting to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's like one of the greatest breakthroughs just conceptually, and I don't know if it could ever apply effectively to these other areas, but when the Uber model came in place of that, you could self-check, like depending on how the driver performed or how the person in the car performed, there was a self-checking system. That was a really, I think, a massive breakthrough psychologically to self-correct and self-monitor people doing their job well or not. Now, if you could actually take that type of model into other areas of, whether it's government or forms of administration where it was actually a total transparency on that level, I think it would be incredibly beneficial for business, everything. If you could create these kinds of transparencies where you have to be accountable for what you do, and it's cataloged, and those who have actually directly encounter you have a say in commenting on what their experience was. But I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's certainly a powerful mechanism. That I think is one of the more powerful displays in the modern world of checks and balances that I've seen, but it hasn't really graduated out of that little component of the taxi world. But I mean, that was always something whether I traveled quite a lot and I'd be in different countries, different places, and I had terrible experiences with cabs. But just I was like, what can you do? I mean, you're kind of caught, right? And to now think there's a self-correction system, I mean, that's fantastic.
And I think that if we looked at politicians, almost any job that you're going to get, you'll have human resources check on your background and see what you've done before. And, it's a good idea to read Snakes in Suits along the way to understand how this system can be tricked. But politicians are not vetted in any way, and the political machines are corrupt. Whether we're talking about the Conservatives or the Labour Party,
right,
or the Liberal Democrats in this country. Liberal Democrats haven't got enough power to be really corrupt, but
right.
they lost power in 1923 and they've never got back. The Republicans and Democrats in the US, it bothered me during the Clinton-Trump elections that I didn't want either of these people to win. You know, I didn't like them. And Joe Biden, having been vice president during Guantanamo Bay, 779 people, of whom 8 have been convicted of crimes. 3 of those convictions were quashed. That's the statistic for Guantanamo Bay. There's a great film called The Mauritanian about a man who spent 14 years and 2 months in Guantanamo Bay and was then released. And you're going, how could that happen? If somebody was in a position of power when that happened, when the torture report was withheld by Obama, when drone strikes were big, I mean, a drone strike, how is that not a war crime? You know, yeah. I'm going to blow up this wedding in a foreign country and kill a load of civilians. But I've long thought that politicians should be held by a simple rule that if they lie, they should be dismissed from politics for a certain period of time, and it should be made well known. So when, and you know, I'm known for the horrible things I've said about Donald Trump, so I'm never going to say anything nice about him. But the way that Barack Obama is being turned into some kind of saint, when he lied about the capture of Osama bin Laden, he said that information had come from interrogations at Guantanamo Bay. That was not true. It came from a phone tap. And the way that he was murdered without, you know, taking the Pakistani authorities, you know, and arresting him properly, extraditing him, trying him, you know, maybe sending him to The Hague. But of course, the US doesn't recognize the international court. So war crimes committed by the US, such as Guantanamo Bay, we have to, but if a politician lies, Margaret Thatcher lied when she said that the Belgrano, the loss of, I think, 800 Argentinian lives, had been, you know, inside the exclusion zone when it was sunk. She knew that wasn't true because she gave the order for it to be sunk. It was like, we'll teach the RGs a lesson, you know. If a politician lies, then they should be banned from politics for 5 years or, you know, a lifetime or what have you. Well, because
we actually wouldn't have a politician in any position. I mean,
you see, I think we would, and I think that it's the cynicism that's been generated that is the worst thing. It's said that until the First World War, people tended to believe the newspapers. But during the First World War, there was so much lying through the Bureau of Information in the US under George Creel, and through the British government here. So many lies were told that belief in the media faded, and you started to get this kind of National Enquirer view of telling stories.
One of the most effective techniques of Trump is the fake news, right? I mean, incredibly profound, because I think that goes to a very core conscious or unconscious belief a lot of people have. They just don't trust the media, you know. And so that's where we are right now. And
what information sources can we trust? And if we can't trust anybody, how do we move forward? Why do we bother to do anything?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's where I think we're in a tricky spot. It's and with the politicians, I mean, for me, again, like I said, I'm not that interested in it because of the profound corruption that's going on. But I think term limits, I mean, not having these career politicians, I mean, I think that's just fosters corruption. If someone can do the position for 20, 30 or 40 years, and it was never, I don't know, I mean, I can't say for the British system, but the American system was always set up, it was supposed to be a service. You would do your term, maybe 2, and then you would go back to your life. You know, these career politicians, I just, I don't blame them, because I think they you know, it seems to be a pretty well-paid job with all sorts of side deals and all sorts of opportunities. But I think until that changes, I don't see how you can expect anything other than what we're getting.
I think that, and there are many interesting, because different countries have different approaches. I mean, in this country, that there was an act of parliament called the People's Act in 1912, which finally allowed politicians to be paid. And it meant that what had happened was that the aristocracy and the upper middle classes were supplying one set of politicians, and the labor unions were supplying the others. And that meant that there was a pressure for them to conform to certain ideas. So they were to be independent, and theoretically allowing payment, a wage, at least a living wage for a politician, would allow somebody who was concerned with the welfare of the people. There are also some politicians who have been lifelong politicians. I would think of Frank Field in this country, who's not well known in the world, but he's a man who's stood up for principle. He's a socialist. I'm not. I don't believe in state control. But at the other end, I don't believe in capital control, the idea that the rich should have control. I do believe in democracy, which I feel is somewhere between those two extremes. But you can't have a democracy until you have a well-informed public. And you can't have a well-informed public until we learn how to assess people's behavior, which is why again and again return to understanding what a predatory person, how they behave, and to look at and to not make heroes out of narcissists, as we've tended to do, but also to look at, in 1938, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis in the US put forward a list of 8 principles for understanding propaganda. They were closed down in 1942. After Pearl Harbor, it was no longer safe, because we had good old Uncle Joe Stalin, our ally and friend, and we had, the lovely Chinese allies who would later, Mao Zedong, our great ally. There are posters that were produced in that period that you can find online about how great these people are and how sneaky the Japanese are, and that so the principles, these 8 simple principles, which you can find on Wikipedia. I did a video about them, which I think is in our Essentials collection somewhere, because there are some rather obvious indicators of deception. And I think that, if we could just sabotage the system and get those straight to 13-year-olds so that they start looking at this, it's the Greta Thunberg effect, that this girl at the age of 15 understood better what was going on in the world than any of the politicians. And for me, one of the great moments was when she addressed the UN Council, and they're all sort of gloating that they've got a photo opportunity with Greta Thunberg, and she's saying, "You're idiots. You are destroying the world. I'm a child. I can see it's happening. What is wrong with you?" And I think we need that pressure to be coming up through the next generation, so that they're not taken in so readily, so readily as we were, by authoritarians, and fight against that one essential problem in human society, which is the psychopathic, predatory style of life, where people are taught that becoming rich and powerful, and is a great and wonderful thing, and rather than giving all the buffalo away that you've just hunted,
No, and it's also, I mean, when you talk about, if there was a system where if a politician lied, they could be, ousted in some form. The same thing with the media. If the media is proven to forward propaganda, so I think we're in a time now where our greatest asset are the whistleblowers. The people that covertly go in and catch the players on tape doing their mischief and saying, "Listen, this is what's really going on behind the scenes." This is what the facade they're putting forward for reasons A, B, and C. But for those of us indoors, inside, this is what we're hearing. This is what we're seeing. I think that's our greatest asset, and I think I commend the people that have the courage to do that, and I think that's one of my greatest hopes, is that more and more of that starts to come out of, and that those people somehow are protected in some way, because that's really going to benefit the whole much greater than trying to, it needs to come from like grassroots kind of, rather than trying to change from the top. I think it's, as we just said, the powers that be are not going to want to let go of those reins So there's got to be some cracks in the veneer from below.
And we have seen change. I mean, and we should be reassured at the extent of that change. In the 19th century in this country, 4-year-old children were sent up chimneys to clean them. And if they got stuck, they were left there. And
Left there?
4-year-old, yes, 4-year-old, well, how are you going to get them out? 4-year-old children were sent down the mines to work, to drag coal trays out. Children were losing their fingers in the mills because they were used to go under the machines and unsnarl them. So the one thing that socialism and the idea of organized labor did bring us was a change from the 12-hour working day, you know, a protection of children, stopping child labor. There was no age of consent in this country until I think the 1870s, when the age was put in at 12 years old. Women were known to sell their daughters for gin. So the shift in society, I think it's worth saying that, you know, even looking at the housing conditions right up until the 1950s, and, you know, look at what happened in the US with the Dust Bowl and Hoovervilles and all of this stuff, that generally standards have risen, but the standard of compassion is the significant one. That are we clever enough to realize that we are part of a whole species and we must look after each other? We must. All week I've been talking about a great movie, a Frank Capra movie called State of the Union, made in 1948 with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn and Angela Lansbury. And the idea is that the Republican Party is looking for a nominee to stand against Truman in the 1948 election. And they pick on Spencer Tracy, who is a self-made millionaire who's designed an aeroplane and, you know, has created an industry from that. And it's wonderful. I watched Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, these great Frank Capra movies where he's talking about exactly the issues we're talking about. So 1948, here he is, he's potentially a Republican candidate. Spencer Tracy says, the wealth of the nation is the health of the nation. So here we are, he's a proposed Republican candidate putting forward the idea of Obamacare in 1948. So to show that the same problems exist, and I think this is a place where you and other people working in movies and in documentary have a tremendous role to play, to just say to people, it can change, and it will change only if all of us take on the responsibility for what we can do. Also, I think it's important to separate out the kind of emotional fervor that drives people, that makes people, there can also be a quiet fervor, you know, where one is determined to get something to happen, but has recognized that other people are human and deserving of kindly and courteous treatment, you know, rather than, you know, being steamrolled by our passions, being convinced. And for that, I always recommend John Stuart Mill's wonderful On Liberty, published in 1859 and still not taught in our schools at any point, where he talks about how to have a discussion with people and how to, you know, arrive at rational conclusions, which we are, you know.
No, I mean, listen, my general feeling towards the world, I would not say is pessimistic. I think there is an awakening of some sort going on. I mean,
definitely.
I think, you know, I think because of the access to so much, there's this kind of opportunity to, you know, take control of your life, and if so motivated, like you're describing, do some research and engage your critical thinking and try to, you know, dig down and find out, you know, things that you want to resolve, and the opportunities are there. I think, you know, but it's a challenge, and it's just whether, you know, you as an individual rise to that challenge or not. But I do feel there is quite a number of people that are rising, and I think that's why the extremism seems to be part of a result of people diving into that, you know, that pursuit, and so it may on on first glance look like it's all coming a part of the sides, but I think it's on some level a divine chaos that's happening that I think will yield some really positive things. So just strap on the chin strap and see where it goes. But I think it's going to get pretty exciting, and we're definitely alive during a time that's not boring. I'll put it that way.
Well, the famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and we certainly do. And there's also something about the precautionary principle that it's not going to harm me to wear a mask. It's not going to harm me to keep a distance. It was very interesting looking at Australia's flu statistics, that as they introduce social distancing, and I think this will probably be true in many places, their flu rates collapsed to about 10% of what they'd been the year before. So by not shaking hands, by wearing masks, by keeping a little bit of distance, we are spreading. There are many diseases that will have gone into decline as a consequence. And that, that then somebody gets upset about, you're taking away my liberties, making me wear a mask. Well, we have laws here about safety belts in cars, and that's taking away your liberty. But it's also making life a lot less difficult for the paramedics, having met somebody who came off a motorcycle and the helmet, having seen what happened to the helmet when it hit the ground, and would have happened to his skull otherwise. Sometimes you have to, nanny state. Sometimes you have to look after people a little bit and stop them, mentally ill people, from possessing assault rifles, for example. That'd be quite a good idea.
Yeah, no, I think it's a crazy balance of, we're social creatures. So you tell people they can't stay next to each other. I mean, there's going to be pushback, right? So yeah, it is interesting, and we'll just see how it all ends up. But I think we've got front row seats to a great show, and let's just see what happens, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And as ever, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. And
absolutely, John. Always. I've got my new list of things to look up now. I have to make lists whenever we talk. I'm like, oh my God, I need to check that out.
Me too. I've got to see. What did you say? It was called Seaspiracy?
Seaspiracy. So it's spelled like SEA.
Yeah.
Seaspiracy.
And you need to watch the Serengeti Rules, and it'll make you a happy man.
And State of the Union. I love Frank Capra, and I'm not familiar with that one. So.
No, I didn't know about it until 2 weeks ago when I saw it. And Tracy and Hepburn, what are you going to say? Always.
Well, I mean, my mother brought us up on films like that, and so she's no longer here, and I get very nostalgic looking at those type of movies, and they're so much fun, and they were very good storytellers back then, much better than most of the writers today.
I think we all got a bit too caught up in the Joseph Campbell hero stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But there's so many different ways to do it, but I think they really did understand how, because I found even movies that weren't great movies, the structure is so good that you still have to sit in and watch what happens, because you want to know what happens, even though it's not maybe a great story. You're like, well, they set it up in such a good way, I want to know what happens. And that's good storytelling. So So
I mean, my other tip to the public in general is Stephen King's book on writing, and it's the only Stephen King book I've read. Of course, we've all seen a dozen or more Stephen King movies. He said he was in a supermarket one day, and some woman said, "You're Stephen King. You write all those horror stories. Why don't you write something nice like The Shawshank Redemption?" And he said, "I did."
Exactly.
But his book on writing is wonderful because I've written novels and what have you myself, because he basically throws away most of the rules and tells you why that's not going to help, and that really having something compelling to say is what's important.
No, I think that
following a series of steps.
I try to write stories that are movies that I'd want to see. Like I'm not trying to write for the public or for the industry per se.
That's so important.
Because it takes so much work and so much rewriting. You better feel like you've got something to say. And one of the things I learned recently was what's really important in storytelling are the philosophical stakes, because we always hear about the external stakes, which is kind of the tangible goal, like in Star Wars, I'm trying to blow up the Death Star, or it's a heist movie, we've got to go get the money, and then there's the internal journey of the protagonist.
Character arc.
Has some sort of emotional thing they have to learn to transform and grow from. But then the thing that really gives the movie kind of a great ending is a philosophical stakes, of which at some point in the film or story, you present a dominant set of values that kind of exists in the world. And this is kind of, where the people that in the know would say, this is how it is. And then you usually introduce, not unlike the Joseph Campbell type thing, another character, be it a mentor-esque type person who says, kid, this is really how it is, and presents the underdog values. And those are the two things that are in conflict, that by the climax of the end of the movie, that character is going to see that all the dominant values look like it's all going to happen. And then by their choice, they're able to actually exercise the underdog values, and everything flips, and then things change. Yeah. And that's a really powerful way to tell a story.
Yeah, something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or American Beauty, stories that show you, something that you weren't necessarily aware of. Exactly. Fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Well, good.
It's been great.
Until the next time, sir, as always.
Yeah. And we'll talk again soon. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. Bite off the poor thing.